Well, thank you, Dr. Swertner, and thank you all for your attendance today. And so we're going to kind of change things up a little bit. You guys probably kicked things off, and you heard a little bit more about kind of the hard science things in terms of maybe some data of getting together and putting a little bit more of a hard science and a different strategy to it. And so we're going to switch things up, and we're going to switch into kind of a social science perspective. And from there, I think that we'll kind of learn some differences and some of the importance that sometimes maybe gets overshadowed and overlooked in regards to some of the hard sciences and such. So we're going to talk about these benefits, and I guess I think back to my childhood, and a little different from my little 2-year-old girl in terms of the cartoons that we had, but I think about Wile E. Coyote and how he always seemed to be the butt of every joke, right? He was the one that everything backfired on him. And so whenever I think about critical thinking, he's actually one of the people that was probably one of the first that I thought about. It's like, why in the world would you do that, right? And so as we go through and we talk today, hopefully we won't be the Wile E. Coyote that's lighting the ignition to the dynamite that's strapped onto his body. All right? So we're going to talk a little, and I guess I've got a little assignment for each of you. And I didn't know how many people were going to be here, so I didn't run copies of this, but I want everybody, if you've got something to write on and to write with, I want you to draw these 9 circles in the rows that they are, okay? And your mission from now until the completion of this talk is that you are to connect all 9 dots with straight lines without lifting your pen or your pencil. So we're going to think about that as we go through this talk. You can work on that if you get bored. All right, so in terms of just defining what is research itself, okay, research. As we talk about science, it's a body of knowledge and the process by which knowledge is collected. And so as we talk about some of my work in terms of kind of the critical thinking, we're going to talk about how did we maybe collect that, how can we implement that, and why is that important as we move forward. So we talk about social sciences, and that is, as I mentioned, a little different, the science of people or the collections of people, such as groups, firms, societies, or economies, and their individual or collective behaviors. And so as we go through and talk about some of this stuff today, I'll give you some objectives as to what we're going to hopefully achieve. We're going to talk a little bit, just very briefly, about elementary cognition. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the background of critical thinking. Where does it originate? Where does the definition of critical thinking come from? Who defines it? And can they agree on a definition of it? All right, we're going to talk about some of the demands of critical thinking. We're going to talk about the challenges. And then we're going to get to some of the benefits. Now, how many of you have heard critical thinking mentioned maybe on syllabus day, something like that in your classes? Anybody heard of critical thinking mentioned before? Yeah. How many of you think that you can properly define what is critical thinking? Well, for a lot of people, students as well as even faculty, it's kind of an ambiguous term. And so we're going to talk about how we go through and we talk and we build things, and maybe we can come to a little bit of a clearer perspective as to how do we finish it out. So we're going to talk about cognition real briefly. All right, and we talked back to like the early 1950s whenever we talk about Mr. Bloom, and he kind of helped us understand learning. One of the buzzwords that you'll hear if you go through any kind of educational meeting is higher order thinking, or hot skills, essentially. And so as we talk about higher order thinking, we get to the upper portion of Bloom's taxonomy, where we jump to analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So as we look at these lower order skills, this is something that for all of us, whether we're faculty or you're a student, you start to maybe look at and you realize, maybe that test that I took last week, did it push me towards the evaluation, towards the creativity component, or towards the analyzing component, or was it simply a multiple choice? I read somewhere just the other day that it said that multiple choice is the death of critical thinking. Something to think about. All right, so as we talk about critical thinking, we know that we're going to get to this upper echelon in terms of cognition, hopefully. All right, so one thing though, that before we even jump deeper into talking about critical thinking skills, I think it's necessary to talk about some words that oftentimes pop up whenever we talk about education, and that is pedagogy, but very seldom do we hear the word andragogy. Pedagogy is simply the education and the teaching of children. Andragogy, on the other hand, is the teaching of adults. Now, what do we consider to be the age of adults? Are you guys all adults? Students? Where are we at? Well, as we talk about these two different kind of definitions and where things come, we get into some variation in terms of what they need to be addressed or how they need to be addressed and where we're going to go from there. So if we think about pedagogy, well, we think about some concepts. We think about abstract behaviors and so forth. We get to andragogy, and that would be us as adults. We think more about application. Why do we need to know that? Why do we need to do that? As we go through and we look at maybe the learner self-concept, they're a little bit more dependent upon personality, whereas over here, an adult, well, they're a little more responsible for their decisions. Experience itself is generally of very little worth in regards to pedagogy. But when we jump to the andragogy side of things, a volume of different quality experiences really builds into kind of some of the lectures and so forth that we need to be having. All right, readiness to learn, we can see that. What are adults typically ready to learn? What are they ready to learn about? Stuff that impacts them. Stuff that they see themselves needing to know. So as we go through and we think about maybe some of the classes maybe that we're even in, I think about my undergraduate career. Was I treated as an adult? Or was I treated as a child? I'm pretty confident I was treated as a child. Heck, even some of my graduate classes, I was probably treated more as a child than an adult. And so as we think about this whole development of critical thinking, maybe we have handicapped our students. Why? What do you think? Is it convenience? Was it more convenient for the teachers? Was it more convenient in terms of actually assessing grades? Who knows? We'll talk about that later. Okay, but those are just kind of some of the pieces of information I think are very valuable. Now, as we look up here, I guess this is one of the things that was really fascinating as I kind of began some of my talks and my discussion and my research about cognition and specifically critical thinking. We are in a constant state of information overload, right? Because if we need something, what do? We pull out our phone and we Google it, right? I was reading something and some of the stats that I had here. We consume over 34 billion pieces of information a day. That's the equivalent of reading 2 books. That's crazy. Crazy. More information has been produced over the last 30 years than what was produced in the last 5,000 years. That's wild. Okay? And specifically now, it's at the touch of our fingers. So that changes the way that we kind of approach things. All right? So what we'd refer to, and maybe is referred to as cognitive fatigue. How many of you have been there before? I have. I was there trying to put this together. Overload. Cognitive fatigue. And we're going to talk about that and actually where critical thinking comes into that. Is it information overload or is it more so filter failure? And so as we talk about filtering things out, we got to be able to find reliable sources, reliable resources, and to be able to build from there. So I think that's pretty impressive there, that quote there. All right. Well, we talked a little earlier about defining critical thinking. They can't agree. Everybody fights over how critical thinking should be defined. And so in reality, there's not necessarily a specific narrowed down focus of exactly how do you define it. So there's a few of them that you can read through real quickly. I guess I try and stick a little bit more simplistically. The ability to deliberate rationally and clearly concerning what to do or what to believe in. All right? The ability to analyze the way that you think and present evidence for your ideas rather than simply accepting, all right, is your personal reasoning as a sufficient proof. What do we tend to do with just our personalities and our beliefs and whenever we try and find logic in things? Well, we oftentimes gravitate towards stuff that we are familiar with rather than pushing ourselves to get outside of the box. How many of you got the puzzle solved? All right, only 2. Keep working. All right. So as we go through and we continue to kind of talk about some dispositions, we talk about critical thinking. So dispositions is they are simply some behaviors, some innate characteristics of people. And so whenever you think about just studying back and looking at critical thinking dispositions, you think of people that are inquisitive, people that are curious. They tend to have higher critical thinking scores. Think about people that use a systematic approach. Those that are judicious, those that seek truth, they're very analytical in terms of how they break things down, if they're open-minded. Those are all dispositions. Well, we think about, on the other side, critical thinking skills. Now, who is it that makes this big deal about critical thinking skills? Where's it come from? Like, why is this such a hot topic? Why is it such a demanded component? Your boss. Your bosses one day. They're the people who want and demand these critical thinking skills. And so as we talk about kind of building them, we've got things like interpretation. Can you interpret what was put to you in terms of maybe you're reading a passage or interpreting some data? Analysis. Are you capable of going through and analyzing a situation and coming up with a problem-free, bullet-proof resolution? So evaluation. Inference. Can you infer things? Can you put together different pieces and make a wise decision in a short amount of time? Explanation and self-regulation. Now, whenever we think about us being in the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences here at Tarleton, there's going to be somebody at some point in their life, whenever you've got a big boy job, when you may be the person that has to resolve that problem. What happens whenever they call and they say that we've got an E. coli contamination? What happens whenever they call you back and they say, well, we've got some kind of an issue in terms of some animal rights production components? Well, we've got to have people that can very quickly on their feet go through a systematic approach and try and minimize the damage, okay, that comes from that. And that's why this is so important, I guess, to me. And so as we think about critical thinking, it allows for people to compare, to analyze, to eventually critique, and then to synthesize and come up with their own information. All right? This is where things get kind of interesting, and it really begins to put the rubber to the road, if you will. Okay, if you think about, these are some employee or employer ratings of critical thinking skills by the population. So they went through and they had polled, I think it was 400 different employers. Those employers would be like on the upper end of management. So they perceive critical thinking skills of high school graduates, well, 70% of them to be deficient. You don't have enough whenever you come out of college. 23%, 2 to 3 year college, so junior college or community college grads. And then 4-year college grads over here at 9%. They perceive adequacy, 30% of them perceive high school. 73 community college grads, and 4-year grads, 63% perceive them to be adequate. Excellent, though, that's where things kind of begin to shift. We think of 4-year colleges to be more on the excellent side of things. And so that kind of is interesting. To me, this was probably of even greater importance, though, was whenever they went through and they asked those employers to rank the most important skills, and we think about soft skills oftentimes, for business growth, what do they rank as the most important, the most frequently? Critical thinking. Okay? So, some of the challenges. This is where things become very, very imperative for us, not only as maybe students, but maybe as faculty to get together, is to come up with a strategy and a plan. All right? So, there's a disconnect in educator training. You know, as I went through my undergraduate career primarily in animal science, the majority of my instructors were never trained in the field of education. They were all trained specifically, and they were awesome at what they were researching, their sciences. So a lot of times there's a disconnect there. There's a disconnect in course content. The timeliness of being able to deliver those courses we oftentimes maybe lose out on. There's a disconnect in student perception and understanding. There's a disconnect in what future employers may ultimately kind of demand you to use. It puts a greater demand on the faculty. It puts a greater demand on students to incorporate critical thinking skills into your courses. Because we're going to talk about case studies, we're going to talk about more group projects, we're going to talk about all these other things that require more time than just you going to class and memorizing a few notes and bubbling in a few A's and B's and walking out. So, as you think about the challenges that are going to kind of fall back on incorporating critical thinking, one of the other components is how do you assess it? Do you have a pre-test? Do you have a post-test? How do you account for what people knew when they came? Is critical thinking innate? Is it a byproduct of knowledge? All some things that present some challenges in terms of maybe creating some critical thinking studies. All right, some of the benefits. Well, you come up with a better approach to just how you handle life. Okay, whenever we think about critical thinking, we think about decision making oftentimes. Okay, the appreciation for differing views. I think that maybe as we talk about Generation Z and millennials, we may be at the timeline where having an appreciation for other people's views is as important as anything that may be up there on that list. Or even the last one, critical thinking serves as the democratic kind of foundation for a democratic society. That's very, very important, okay, whenever we think about finding balance. Okay, being able to make decisions, to reason, to promote creativity, those are all some components that come hand in hand with that. So how do we foster these skills? Well, as faculty, one of the things that we have to do is that you have to ask a lot of questions. Okay? And it starts out oftentimes with you just pushing those students to think. Okay? Using a variety of methods and different strategies so that you can accommodate a variety of different learning styles is going to be mandatory. So set the scene for learning. You've got to have planned out and strategized how you're going to address those type of things. Okay, give adequate thinking time to brainstorm, etc. You know, one of the things that as a faculty member, as a teacher, that's the toughest about instilling critical thinking is the fact that you lose control. You don't know where class is going to get that day. You don't know where it's going to end next week necessarily. But as long as they're learning and they're thinking outside the box, well, you're teaching them kind of how to move forward in terms of their critical thinking skill development. One of the things that here at Tarleton that we kind of have an employment of, specifically in our department, is the fact that we instill the block classes as well as the experiential learning components in terms of internships. And so as we think about the different models, we could go through Kolb's, and we'll just go through this one real simplistically. When we think about first and foremost, we learn from our experiences. We learn by doing. And so as we talk about having an experience or an activity, you perform it, you do it. Next thing, okay, you think about is sharing those ideas, okay? Putting those results, those reactions, and those observations, putting them out publicly, all right? Whoops. Processing, discussing, looking back. What can I do to maybe make that better, all right? Generalizing it, well, connecting that experience to a real world kind of problem or example that we may come up with. And then applying it to the next time, moving forward. So that's kind of an experiential learning model, a little bit different from what Kolb's would be, but very similar at the same time. Big three components, though, you have is doing, reflecting, and then applying. So as we go through and we think about some of the things that we have, and actually what drew me to kind of doing some research on critical thinking was my former life in terms of coaching collegiate livestock judging teams. I had the opportunity to work with a ton of students over the years, and we always made the claim that we were helping build their critical thinking skills throughout there. In reality, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Maybe we were just enhancing their soft skill development a little bit more. But there are a lot of decisions that have to be made. Okay, we think about here at Tarleton, one of the things as to why it's so important, I think, for us to maybe approach some research on this and to collect some data is the fact that we have over 8,500 students that come in for our career development events. Well, if we have all these employers who are wanting these skills, it might be important for us to be able to provide them. So, as we kind of move forward, I think that's very important. So, learner-centered approaches, okay, you keep them focused around the learner themselves, actively engaging the students in the learning process, utilizing divergent questioning, Socratic questioning, etc. Goes on and on and on. So who got it figured out? Just you two? Just you three? What's the key? How many of you didn't get it figured out? I'm not picking on anybody. Well, whenever we think about items critically, sometimes we fail to think outside of the box. It's easier to stay within the confines and the boundaries that we are familiar with. Remember, what was the direction? What were the directions for this? 4 lines. Couldn't pick your pen up. Very few of us would have thought to have gone outside of the box. So, as we move forward, I guess this is something that adds a little comedy to it. You see the professor up there, expect you all to be independent, innovative, critical thinkers who do exactly as I say. Well, sometimes we maybe fall into that trap. So anyway, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.